The church really was on the verge of going under and having to be sold. But God had different plans, surprising plans. Good afternoon. I invite you to join me, Ed Phillips, and my guest, Reverend Michael Spurlock, and hear a story of God's providence and provision on Weekend Connection. Good afternoon, my friend. Welcome to Weekend Connection on the Bible Broadcasting Network. My name is Ed Phillips, and I have on the telephone line with me Reverend Michael Spurlock. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, Ed. Thank you for having me.
I thank you for joining me on Weekend Connection. I appreciate the time you're taking with me and with our BBN listeners. Michael, you have quite a God story that took place quite some time ago in one of your churches when
hmm
you and your family were in Tennessee. And I want to get to that. But first, tell me and tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself and what you were doing before you got into the ministry.
Well, I went to college in Knoxville, Tennessee, at the University of Tennessee, and then afterwards I moved to New York City to pursue a career in publishing. And while there, I met my wife, who was from Florida, and in time we had our first son. And then moved back to Tennessee, where I continued publishing, but also was involved. I spent a year in sales in Nashville, and then discerned a call, was sent to seminary in Wisconsin, and it was from there that my bishop appointed me to a small church south of Nashville in Smyrna, Tennessee.
Okay, so now you are at a church in Smyrna,
That's
and
right.
things are not going all that well, and you're having to assess things and make some pretty big decisions, right?
Yes, and some unhappy ones in the beginning. I arrived 6 months after they suffered a congregational split, and the folks who stayed with the church, initially there were a dozen people who stayed, and by the time I got there in the summer of 2007, it was up to 25. But these 25 people were worshiping in a building that had an $850,000 mortgage on it, and the payment at that time was $5,500 a month, plus all the other expenses that are attendant with maintaining a church, its building and its ministry. And it looked like we were just never going to dig out of that financial hole. We would never grow fast enough to outpace the financial hole we would start digging ourselves going forward. So we decided the only option was to sell the property and the building and try to start the church over from scratch, say in a storefront, a rented storefront or something like that.
So, did that happen? What ensued from there?
No, well, that was our plan. And then God spoke a powerful word into the midst of our situation and changed everything. And nothing went according to plan to our plan after that. What happened was the sale of the property just took an unusual amount of time to execute. We had to get an appraisal and an inspection and find a realtor, and all that just took so much more time than we thought it ought to, that the wheels just moved really slow on it, such that we were still in our building at Christmas and we were still in our building in Easter of 2008. And it was at that time that a group of a small group of refugees from Burma showed up at our door. Behind this initial group of five who came to talk to me, there were 65 more of them looking for a church, but then also looking for help with food, clothing, medical care, transportation, employment, all the things that just the basic necessities of life. When they told me what their needs were, I thought, oh man, we've got troubles of our own. We're about to lose everything we know as church. I don't know how we're going to be of any help to you all.
Had they just landed in the Nashville area when they came to your church?
They had not just landed, they were, and even today still unclear how long they had been there. But of course, they were all arriving at different times too. I mean, they just weren't resettled as community of 65. It started with one family and then another family came. And, the community had grown over a period of time that I'm not even aware of the length of. But they were on their own and they began looking for a church.
So they come to your church, and where do you go from there?
I sat down with Ye Win, who he's their spokesperson, their kind of the community leader, and he tells me what their needs are. And what I am thinking is, as I said earlier, come on, we got problems of our own. And I was afraid an overwhelming refugee ministry would swamp an already vulnerable congregation. But then there's Jesus, and what Jesus commands us to do in relation to our neighbor and in relation to people in need. And then you also remember what God said about how to treat strangers and aliens who come and live in your midst. And what I found myself saying was, look, I don't know what good we're going to be to you. I don't know how this is all going to work out, but you come on and you come to church with us and we'll figure it all out together. That began to change everything, both for the refugees and for the existing congregation.
So, what happened from there? How did God lead you and your congregation and the refugees who came to your church?
Well, immediately we went from, by the time they arrived in Easter of '08, we had gotten attendance up to about 40 people a Sunday. And then after Yewin and this small group came the next Sunday, 65 new members showed up and we had over 100 people. But the refugees were very poor, so they didn't contribute any significant resources that would change our financial picture. But we began trying to do for them what we could do. And so we didn't have a lot of material resources and we couldn't engage in a kind of handout ministry to them. But we looked around at what we did have, and we had a fella who had taught English as a second language to Asians when he was stationed in Vietnam. We started an English as a second language class for them. And then we discovered that it wasn't just the language they were having difficulty with, it was understanding just basic life skills in a new culture. So we began teaching them how to open bank accounts and how to use an ATM machine and how to go to the grocery store and where not to shop. They were shopping at little gas station supermarkets,
Hmm.
and paying 2 and 3 times more for
Hmm.
things what they could have if they went to just a normal grocery store. So just little things like that that were that we take for granted, but that they had no experience with at all. So we began doing things like that for them. And then helping kids who were just entering into school with their homework and helping them get up to speed with the language was a major benefit to the community. So those were some things that we could do and we could pull off. But in the meantime, Yewin asked me for permission if they could plant some gardens on our church property. And this was one thing we had an overabundance of, and that was land. Our church sat on 22 acres of land, 17 acres of which were old flat bottom farmland. And I said, yeah, you can plant gardens out there, but we're going to sell the church and leave. So I don't know if you'll put the work in, but you might not get anything out of it. We might have to abandon your gardens before you harvest anything. As a consequence, they didn't plant any gardens. But then we got an offer on the property, and that's when the rubber really begins to meet the road. And I was at this point, was so frustrated. What I began to think was, this took so long, and I took a walk out on the back of the property. And that's when God spoke to me and told me, Michael, I've given you farmland and I've sent you 65 expert farmers from the other side of the world. You're supposed to start a farm here, and the farm will save the church. We secured the permission to not sell the property and to start the farm. And what we began with was just a lot of summer vegetables, food, squash, beans, radish, lettuce, cabbage. We needed to grow food, is what was part of God's plan here. That would provide a supplement to the Korean, and give them what they had asked us for. Could we plant gardens because we need food? And then we had so much land, we could produce enough to begin selling the surplus, and that would help us meet our church expenses.
And it helped a great deal, didn't it?
It salvaged the whole situation.
So, did you sell vegetables and what have you every day, or was it just on Saturdays, or how did that
Just
all
on
work out?
At first, what we were doing was feeding the Korean. So when the first bits of produce, when we first started harvesting, that went straight to the Korean, and that was its first purpose. And then we began taking what we grew to the farmers market in Murfreesboro, which is a larger town next to Smyrna. And we began selling things there. And then Ye Win got us a customer from Nashville, this fella who owned a chain of sushi stands in supermarkets, and he said he'd buy every cucumber we could produce. So we had a little commercial customer there. And all of that was great, but it was insufficient still to meet the needs. The Korean brought with them, though, was seeds from Burma for an Asian vegetable that is not grown here in the United States. The English name they use for it is sour leaf. Their Korean name is untranslatable, but it's a leafy green that we could sell for $3 a pound. And when you harvested it, you usually got about 1,000 pounds at a time. And Ye Win could sell every bit of it in one shipment. And that became the cash crop for us that did make a bit of a difference in our circumstances. But what really turned it around, though, was the life that took hold. And here was a church that was, we were going to fail and we were going to lose it. And suddenly it has more people than it had at its healthiest point. It was truly healthy. It was centered on Christ. It was two unique groups of people coming together and loving one another and living alongside of one another and really throwing their lot in with one another. And then all these miraculous things began to happen in our midst. God was so present.
And that was over how long of a period of time?
Well, as I said, I arrived in the summer of 2007, and we planted our first crops in the summer of 2008, and they're still farming today on the property. So it's continued. But my tenure there ended in the summer of 2010, and I was called come onto the staff of a church here in New York City.
But they're still farming the land. And what a story of God's working and of wonderful stewardship.
Indeed, there's so many miracles that took place that I witnessed in the time I was there. When we needed very curious and specific things, God would provide for us. I think the most remarkable was after we had gotten the farm going, and of course it was very labor intensive. We didn't have a lot of heavy equipment or equipment sufficient to the task. We just had a lot of human laborers. The work was hard, and I was telling the story to anyone I could think of, and I was becoming physically exhausted and psychically exhausted and emotionally exhausted and spiritually exhausted. And one day I told my wife, we've got to get out of here. I need a break. And so we drove up to a state park to take a hike and just get away from town, get away from the church. And we had a rule. We weren't going to talk about the farm at all or church or anything. Just go away, be together, and take a breather. At that time, our most critical need we had decided was help with watering. How are we going to water the crops? And we decided we needed a 1,000-gallon water tank mounted on a trailer with a pump attached to it. And used, that piece of equipment goes for $10,000. And we were only ever operating with, if we had $1,000 in the bank, we were flush in our point of view. So we get up there in this state park on a Monday. Nobody is in the park except another family. And we ran into them on the hiking trail. And it turned out the man, and we got to chatting with them. The man was a soybean farmer from Missouri. And when I told him that my church had started a farm, he said, well, we've got a lot of equipment that we've outgrown as our operation has gotten bigger. Is there anything you need? And I said, well, we need 1,000-gallon water tank mounted on a trailer with a pump attached. And he said, I have one of those. You can have it.
Wow.
I was in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere, when I meet the man who has exactly what we need and gives it to us for free.
That's
It
just like
was
God.
like, it was, yeah, God works in these old familiar ways, like at the waters of Meribah.
Hmm.
The only difference being is that I learned from Moses' mistake, and I give God the credit for the water.
What a story. Just the way God works, it's incredible. And we
Right.
shouldn't be
And
surprised, but we are, aren't we?
we are. We we kind of forget that he's alive and well and still working, and that he works in his old, familiar, and trustworthy ways. And I've been convinced of that by seeing him at work in a way I never envisioned that I would be privileged to see in my life.
He is at work every single day. And
Yeah.
Michael, I deeply appreciate you sharing this story. And I just want to briefly mention that there has been a movie made based on this true story. It's called All Saints, and it will be coming out in a matter of days on August 25th. I want to make clear, and I know you do too, that this movie is not any sort of political statement one way or the other. But basically, it's just what Jesus commands us to do as followers of Jesus, and that is to love and to welcome and to share our lives and share the good news.
That's right. And Jesus wouldn't ask us to do that if that was going to imperil us.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining me today on Weekend Connection. I deeply appreciate the time you've taken with me. Weekend Connection is a public affairs program of the Bible Broadcasting Network. Remember, my friend, you can go online and listen to Weekend Connection on demand. Go to bbnradio.org, go to the Programs tab, click on that, and then click Programs on Demand. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for listening to this feature, a production of BBN, the Bible Broadcasting Network. BBN provides 24-hour Christian programming, great Christian music, and Bible teaching. Listen to BBN by clicking the link in the description.